Peter Carnochan is my guest today. Peter is a psychologist, psychoanalyst, and executive coach here in San Francisco, California. He was first introduced to me in 2014 by Alexis Ohanian, the co-founder of Reddit. And Alexis basically just said I needed to meet his executive coach and that I might benefit from chatting with him. 4+ years later, I chat with Peter just about every other week. And this conversation isn't unlike many I've had before with Peter, just mics included. We go from tactical topics to expansive philosophical ones and back. And that's why I really love chatting with Peter. I'm trying out an experiment where we do check-in episodes together every few weeks, where he checks in on the project of this podcast, talks about his favorite takeaways from the perspective of being one of the most highly regarded executive coaches in Silicon Valley, as well as the below-the-line journey of what's going on in creating this podcast. You'll see why I love chatting with this brilliant guy during this episode and hear our top takeaways from previous episodes. Also, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and at the very end, you'll hear us touch on that from both the creator and human aspect. And I chat about some of the best advice I've ever heard on the topic. With that, I give you Peter Carnochan. This is Below the Line. All right, Peter, how are you doing?
I'm good. Really good to be here, James.
I'm really glad to have you here. We've spoken innumerable hours over the course of several years, and now it's the first time with microphones in front of us.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's a little different, but I bet we'll fall right back into the groove after a few minutes. We're sharing today's drink is Ceremonial Matcha.
Beautiful.
So cheers to that. And we're drinking it in, my friend Andrew makes these amazing handmade mugs, beautiful mugs. Andrew Aberg makes these mugs that I drink my matcha out of. And if there's any ulterior motive for this podcast, I think it would be to get people off of coffee and onto it's becoming increasingly clear the more I record these episodes. I keep going back to matcha that is my favorite form of caffeine. But today it's ceremonial grade matcha from Japan, and fitting because it's a ceremonial kind of thing for us to touch base, every 2 weeks or so, in my own executive coaching journey, and you being my coach, the topics we cover are always so expansive. It is like just hilariously expansive, but also they're just what I need every 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things I've just loved about working with you, is that you have such a capacity to go from the pragmatic and the here and now and the demands of what you're doing in your job to these very big concepts of meaning, of purpose, and of spirituality. And I love that. It's my favorite place to visit.
Well, it is. That's why I think we clicked, and I over the years had some of the best CEOs in the world introduce me to a few different executive coaches, and really loved getting to meet so many of them here in the Bay Area. But I'd say about, I guess like 4 years ago or so, we met, and it was, it just clicked right from the start for the exact same reasons. You can go from 3 feet out to 30,000 feet, and it's just always delightful to chat with you. So I think that that's why I'm looking forward to this this time with you this morning, because it is one, it's always good to check in, but two, on my own journey. But I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the different things that people have shared, different guests have shared on the podcast. And for listeners, Peter he was a child psychologist for how many years?
30
years, and an executive coach. And over the last 5 or 6 years has become more and more of this amazingly well-regarded executive coach, and probably utilizing a lot of your child psychology, especially with me, principles. But yeah, I think the best place to start in this first check-in episode, something that I think we'll do every 5, 6, 7 episodes, is I think this first one deserves a little bit of background on us. We met 4 or 5 years ago. And do you want to tell a little bit about your background before that, how you got into executive coaching and then us meeting?
Sure. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate. And so questions of meaning and how does one skillfully live a life has been in my mind for many years. And after working as a psychologist and a psychoanalyst for a number of years, I really have become interested in what I call the affective relational skills of living a good life. And I thought, I was hearing more and more about executive coaching. I have a good friend, Cameron Yarbrough, who started a coaching company, and he tapped me on the shoulder and said, come on for the ride. And I did, and I was really delighted to do it.
How did you know Cameron?
I knew him through the psychology world. He first started a clinic here in San Francisco called the Well Clinic, and he called me in as a sort of senior consultant there. And then he started to pivot into coaching, and I went along for the ride.
And where did you grow up?
Here. My dad came out to teach at Stanford the year I was born, and so I'm one of the rare California natives, and I was here before Silicon Valley started, and I went to school with some of the people who were there at Park Research Center, and it was all around me.
Well, one of the questions that I ask everyone is tell me 3 stories that help shape your life. And I know I didn't prep you for this episode with those, but as you've listened to the episodes and maybe reflect on other people's stories, have any stories of your own come up that have helped shape who you've become?
Sure. Well, I had the good fortune of going to an alternative school called the Peninsula School down in Menlo Park, and it's been around since 1920. Very progressive, a lot of arts. It's on 10 acres of land. It's unbelievable, And I'm a left-hander, and so my mind is wired a little differently, a little less conventionally. And I was later to read than my sisters. They had learned to read at 3 or 4. I was
interesting. Is that related to left-handedness?
So. Well, not necessarily, but I definitely
orientation?
You definitely have a different wiring if you're a lefty, for sure.
Interesting.
And now we'd been in England for a year on sabbatical, and I'm now 8, and I'm still not a fully fluent reader. And I'm realizing it's time because I'm watching people around me, and I'm a competitive guy, and I'm like, uh-oh, it's time for me to get on this task. And I had a teacher named Woody, and she had been teaching. She had graduated from Stanford in the 1920s, hard to believe, and had been teaching kids reading at this school for that whole time.
Wow.
And I had taken a book off the shelf, a chapter book called Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which was too ambitious for me at that moment. And probably, I don't know how long it was, but maybe 10 minutes. I'm daunted.
And you're 8?
Yeah, I'm 8. And I bring it back to Woody, and I said, I've read it. She, of course, knew right away that I hadn't. And she said, oh, you read it? Well, what's it about? And I'm like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And I go, well, Bedknobs and Broomsticks. And she goes, well, who was in it? And I'm like, oh, I don't really remember. And then she did something and I knew the gig was up, I knew that I was found out.
Right.
And I'm waiting to be humiliated. But she said, okay, well, let's put it back and let's get you another book. And so she found just the right balance between helping me know that wasn't going to work, that the magical version of reading wasn't the same thing as real reading, but she didn't humiliate me, and she allowed me to save faith in such a way that I became incredibly grateful to her. And by the end of that year, I was, an utterly fluent reader, and she was a true saint. So
wow.
that would be one story.
Do you think about that story often in your own work with child psychology?
For sure. There's an analyst from England named Adam Phillips, and he wrote an incredible book called Going Sane. And the last,
I've heard about this book. Yeah.
yeah, and he's sort of saying, well, we have so many accounts of madness and valorizing the creativity of madness. And then we have another version of the dullness of sanity, but we never really have articulated what a vibrant version of sanity looks like. And that's what he tries to do in this book. And the very last line of the book is so surprising. He says, the sane dedicate whatever resources they have to never knowingly humiliating another.
That's how he ends the book.
That's how he ends the book.
The entire book on sanity. Do you mind saying that one more time?
Yeah, that the sane dedicate whatever resources they have to never knowingly humiliating another. And I've thought a lot about that, and about, shame wants us to repeat an event 1,000 times in our brain so that you learn never make that mistake again. But it is a brutal and unsubtle teacher, and since it never stops, all you can ever do is hope to go in hiding. And so ultimately, while that it is good in installing a prohibition, it is not good at subtle learning. And so, trying to understand what are the conditions where people can actually feel safe enough to confront what is difficult within themselves.
Wow. There's so much there. Shame and prohibition, rather than, the subtle art of encouragement. Well, okay, so that is an extremely powerful story. Is there another one or two that comes to mind that helps shape who you've become?
Maybe I'll jump from being very young to something much more recent. And from a young age, I was in some ways a philosopher. I started to think about infinity when I was 5, and I started to realize, wait, where does space end? It can't end, because I realized to think the ending of space, you have to truly think the thought of nothing. And this is Heidegger's great question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And it makes it clear that nothing is not empty space. That is very much a something. And since you can't think the thought of nothing, it becomes apparent that somethingness has always been here. And so throughout my life, I keep coming back to this meditation on an infinity. And I was once meditating quite deeply, and I started to think about the moment of the Big Bang, where everything is in a singularity, everything is tightly bound together. And I was thinking the thought of God, which is, should we do it again? Because clearly, if you're aware of the whole story, you know that if you ignite the Big Bang, that everything that can happen will happen again. And that means that to commit to the plurality of the universe is to commit to great suffering and trauma. You can't say yes to the Big Bang without saying yes to death, destruction, war, catastrophe.
Do you mind walking me through that?
Of why that is?
Yeah.
Because infinity is so big and so long that anything that can happen will happen eventually.
And everything is happening.
For sure.
Everything is happening right now.
Yes. If you look far enough out into space, deep enough into space, you'll see that there are no limits to space, and therefore unless there is so much room that anything that can happen is happening somewhere right now. And so I was trying to really get myself inside the mind of the yes. And what I got.
And when was this?
This was maybe 5 years ago or something, maybe 7. And I started to understand that the quality of that radical yes, where nothing is left out, is a quality of equanimity. It's not warm and loving. It's not like, oh, it's so sweet and everything is beautiful and fantastic and soft. There are incredibly painful things that you have to commit to if you're going to say yes to the Big Bang.
Is that balance? Is when you say equanimity, do you mean, are you thinking balance?
No, I'm thinking about it's a deep relaxation. It is a relaxation that undergirds whatever might be happening, however much suffering there is, that there is a deeper level that can hold the whole of that. And that it is an awareness that if you want to have all of the beauty of the world, and there is so much of it in this world, that the price of that is also the suffering in the world. And that nothing can be left out, and that rather than trying to tighten and keep tightly bound to your preferred outcomes, this kind of gets us some into the beginning of your podcast, that the real foundation is this ground of deep relaxation and acceptance, a commitment to saying yes to the whole story.
Well, and what goes through my mind as you say that is you're saying yes to the whole story, knowing that there is no other way.
Yes.
There is no, it's, below the line, there is no above the line iceberg of 10% unless you have the 90% below. There is no life without death. I think one in many ways that can sound kind of so hand wavy or kind of woo-woo talk, but the truth is it's all you have to do is look under a microscope and see your life depends on your white blood cells decimating in potential infection.
That's right. There's war inside your body.
Right. It's one of my favorite philosophers that I talk about quite often, Alan Watts, just says that, it's conflict at one level is harmony at another. And I always think of that literal example of under a microscope, it is, your body is destroying things for you to live. And you will be, if you go through, and I think it's so hard for us to think about this because, we're in the 21st century, it's 2019. We have 2019 technology, but we still have 16th century psychology. Like we think of this model of, all right, there was a day when the world didn't exist. 7 days later, it exists, and we were made from nothing. And that psychology, I think it's since Vatican II, now even, the Catholic Church agrees with biological evolution. And that story, which I think has been only adopted in a mainstream ways, maybe 50 years old. And that psychology or that story allows for a very different psychology when you look at that story of creation is just billions of years of life and death, life and death, life and death, and an upgrade each time.
I think that's what I love about your, the name of your podcast, Below the Line, and the image of the iceberg is that one can look at the 10% that is above the water and think that's a story, but the stability of the iceberg, the reason that it is floating along as it does is because of the 90% below the water, and that means it would be very hard to tip it over, that it has a confidence in some ways because everything that is submerged. And so in a way, Freud's great realization is that our conscious mind is only a small part of who we are, that there is these vast, levels of unconscious thought, of unconscious procedural knowing, that is part of how we navigate the world. And that really beginning to make contact with that is, to me, a much more reliable form of confidence than the more, puffed up or killing version that people talk about, that we're going to somehow hack our way to perfection.
Right. Well, then we'll get into that. I'm certain in this episode. But real quick, I think maybe in some way I remembered that you studied philosophy, but I didn't. I actually, I think you've told me that, but I forgot. So where did you study philosophy?
I studied at Harvard.
And what made you choose, one, to go across the country? What made you choose philosophy? before and then I'm going to, obviously get into how you chose psychology from that.
Sure.
But I want to start with philosophy.
Well, I mean, I think I was thinking about philosophy from very early on. My dad would tell me paradoxes, and he would say, okay, Zeno's paradox, if you shoot an arrow towards a target, it should never reach it because it first have to go halfway, and then from there halfway again, and then halfway again, and there halfway again, and there's an infinite number of halfways, so it can never reach the target. How is it that the arrow reaches the target? And he would tell me these things, and I would go, wow, that is so amazing. And I would start thinking about it, and I would think, well, it gets there because the arrow is not shot towards the target. The arrow is shot towards infinity.
And the target's in the way.
So, it
right.
pierces it along the way in its ultimate destination.
Wow.
I didn't know that when I got to Harvard, that I was going to study philosophy. I just wanted to really look at big questions. And psychology was much more of an empirical science at Harvard. Like, you're going to do research and you're going to do questionnaires. And I wanted to go straight to big questions of meaning. And it was in the philosophy department that I saw that I could best do that.
Was it a choice between, had you already been inclined towards psychology at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I was already reading about psychoanalysis. I was reading Winnicott, who's a really brilliant child analyst from England.
In high school, you're already reading that.
My dad had brought home a book called The Piggle, which was his treatment of a young girl, because he was writing a book about childhood in the 18th century. And I read this book of The Piggle.
And what kind of professor was he again?
An English professor.
Okay, English.
Yeah,
right.
18th century English. And I read this story of The Piggle, and I just remember Winnicott's ability to understand it was a 5-year-old girl who was upset because a younger daughter had been born, and she was really struggling with that. And through the play, Winnicott starts to be able to crack the meaning, the deeper meaning, the below the line meaning of what her worries are about. And I remember at the very end, she wants to bring her younger sister to one of the last sessions that they're going to have. And she's worried, though, that will she lose her special relationship with Winnicott if she does this? And Winnicott sort of says, you could bring her because your sister would meet a different version of me. The version you've had of me is just for you. There was a sense of really understanding that deep need for attachment, of the most profound connection. So when I was at Harvard, I sort of sought out the psychoanalytic classes that were available. There weren't many of them. I took a course called The Psychology of Religion from a Quaker guy, and that was fantastic. And I was exposed to the philosophy of Nietzsche. And maybe that would be another story, was I'm reading Nietzsche and it's making no sense to me. He talks about will to power, and it seemed arrogant and mean-spirited at first glance. And I'm like, I don't get what this is about. But I was at Martha's Vineyard at spring break on a kind of clear day. We were camping on some land there. And all of a sudden, I understood what he meant by this, that it's not a theory of human power. It is about the energetics of being. That, if coming back to this question that Heidegger has of why is there something rather than nothing, Nietzsche sees that being at every moment radiates outward, and that any one thing in the world. And
by the way, for listeners, you're getting a taste of why. If this is over your head, I'm a slow Texan that tries to keep up with Peter, but it's why these conversations are so much fun, because it's just pulling in information that I just don't really hear many places, and it's always in the reflections after the conversation of similar to your Nietzsche experience. I'm like, oh, that's what Peter meant. But okay, so
I hardly think of you as a slow Texan. I think of you as having a deep natural affinity for this kind of stuff.
Well, you're way beyond me in this, and bring me well out of my comfort zone. So There's, simpatico there. So, okay, so you're camping and you're reflecting on, when did you read Nietzsche?
I was a sophomore in college at the time.
Okay, and so this is maybe months later or weeks later?
No, I'm in the middle. I'm in the middle
Okay.
of the class, and I'm trying. And at one moment, I'm making no sense of Nietzsche, and all of a sudden, I understand what he means by will to power. Is that each moment of being, each atom is an energetic, radiant outward, and therefore, nothing has its identity within itself. This is very much what the Heart Sutra in Buddhism talks about, is that everything is determined by its relationship to every other thing. That, these cups that James was describing, they're very beautiful. And we can think, oh, the cup has its identity because it's relatively static in this particular moment and in this particular environment, because the molecules of air are not bombarding it that violently.
And our perception is, it's not connected to anything. It's its own
thing. But of course, if I drop it to the ground, or if we came back in 1,000 years, we would see that the slow interaction with it and all other things around it would have caused it to dissolve.
Right. And it's like, even just describing it almost required me to describe the person that actually made it.
Mm-hmm.
And that
right.
person is its own version of a non-isolated entity.
Right.
And was guided by many people that helped create him and his path in life. Okay, I'm following a little bit. Yeah.
So I got very excited about Nietzsche, and I started to see real connections between Winnicott, the child analyst's account of how the self is formed relationally in connection with the parents, and Nietzsche's idea of the relational nature of the self. And so that I wrote a thesis on that, and
And do you mind explaining a little more on will to power?
Will to power,
and the one of the seminal concepts of Nietzsche.
Man, this takes me way back.
Yeah, this is just
not something I talk about in my ordinary life.
It's so fascinating.
In traditional Western metaphysics, Plato would say that everything had its being within itself. And so this reaches its final culmination in Kant's idea of the thing in itself. And he says, we can never know the thing in itself because all we ever have access to is the appearance of the thing. So this cup, we know it because light bounces off of it and comes into our eyes, and then we construct an image in our mind, or we touch it and energy goes up from our fingertips up into our brain and we construct a sense of it. But we're never in direct contact with the thing in itself. Nietzsche says, no, that's not right. There's no such thing as a thing in itself. That the fact that we know things through appearance is equivalent to the way it is constructed. It is constructed relationally. The atoms within the ceramics are bonding to each other. And we know it relationally. And so there is, in a way, by understanding this energetic nature of being, one no longer has to mourn that the world lies outside of our reach. We are always knowing things perspectively, partially, but that in no way is inadequate, that it's enough. And that our goal is not to know the one true version of the cup within itself, but the cup from as many different perspectives as possible. I would say, part of what I love about coaching is that a lot of the CEOs I work with are incredibly open-minded. When I began talking with you, you were really interested to know how different people saw you. You weren't saying, oh, that makes me nervous, or I don't like that version of myself. I want to know that version of myself. And so who is James? Well, there's James as you know yourself, but there's also James as your wife, your daughter, your mother and father, your siblings, your employees know you. And all of that is what makes up who James is, not any one version over the other.
Wow. Well, it is. Yeah. Well, there's so many things going through my mind right now, and hearing this is just. And by the way, this is the below the line version of my conversations with Peter and executive coaching. It is as much about the dynamics and logistics of the here and now, and maybe um, a work issue that I'm working through
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with my day job,
Mm-hmm.
and then can switch all the way to these broader themes that, to your point, I think are, and I maybe this is just my own preternatural wiring, is to think that they are completely correlated. They are very much interrelated.
Well, I mean, I think that's where we began, is you were at Tilt, and it was a challenging time. You know, you were trying to get a round of funding that was going to be elusive. And the company had grown really rapidly. You'd had a really big valuation, and a lot of weight was on your shoulders. You know, you developed a heart arrhythmia, I think in part
Mm-hmm.
just because of
Bless you.
the deep pressures that you were under. And part of what we were working on was both how do you have that next pitch meeting, how do you talk with your co-founder, how do you talk with your employees, but also how do you manage this level of demand and stress. And you know, I think from the beginning you were really interested and open to, okay, let's take it to the final, story. Like, okay, this company might really work or it might not, and how do I find some peace no matter what?
Mm-hmm. Equanimity.
Yeah.
And Eric Ries talks about that
Mm-hmm.
in episode 3.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like so many things, you can hear these words, and it's just a word that says so casually and quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and or like the concept that you spoke about with Nietzsche, and then you reflect on it over and over again. Equanimity and that peace,
Mm-hmm.
that ability to hold both
Mm-hmm.
is where it's at.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and to kind of tie the two paths in a bow, we met about 4.5 years ago or so, and yeah, I remember where we're sitting. We met in our office, the Tilt headquarters, and it was
I just want to tell the story of actually our first interview.
please.
So Tilted was in this beautiful warehouse, converted warehouse space down by the train tracks. And the only enclosed space in there was a glass-walled conference room. And I remember having this interview with you, and the whole company was watching us in some ways have this interview. And I thought, this is a really remarkable place to have a first interview over such personal issues in a way, and that sense of exposure I thought was a great metaphor for what CEOs have to deal with all the time. They're always in some ways having heated personal moments within a glass walled room, people looking in.
It's one of the I say best, but it's just the realest part of the jobs is that you have 19 different reflections on you at every moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the best part of the job, because then you really get that perspective, 19 different perspectives, rather than in many roles it's just what
Mm-hmm.
you're doing. And many companies that don't value feedback or don't value seeking out the different perspectives in many professions, is just that one thing you do and your version in your own head, and you don't get those sometimes jarring, but most of the time you find the equilibrium of what's real between all 19 different reflections.
Yeah. And I would even say that the task is not necessarily to average over the 19. Like, okay, I'm going to accumulate them, and then I'll say, I'll give 10% to that perception and 5% to that perception. I think what's most interesting is to be able to keep alive the plurality of those views, to actually take a moment and to play with the idea, let's say that story is completely true. Because in allowing it to exist as its own reality, I think then there's the greatest possibility of learning from it. Not that you're going to say, that's the only story about me, but I'm not going to diminish the the use of that version or the legitimacy of that version, because somebody out there does experience you that way. And to be effective, you want to be able to know and respond skillfully to however people experience you. And some people are going to say, whoa, you're a tall white Texan. I'm going to have a very strong feeling about that. And some people are going to go, you're so kind and authentic and genuine, I love you. And other people are going to go, man, you must be arrogant. And not saying, well, one is true and one is not true, but to go, okay, I'm going to now run into somebody who is prone to see me in that way. How do I work with that? How do I take in what is true about that without being dislodged from my own sense of who I am?
Yeah, I think for people receiving feedback, what some great advice I got one time is that you count all the votes, but don't count them equally. Mm-hmm. And take in the feedback, but it would be like, and I think we're still in these early innings of professional development to even know how to give this type of feedback, whereas something like the sports realm is eons ahead, mm-hmm. where it's like Steph Curry, the best 3-point shooter in basketball in the world, he's probably only listening to 2 people yeah. about his shot. Shooting coach, head coach, and maybe his dad. Yeah. His dad, exactly. And so maybe 3 people. Mm-hmm. And in a professional environment, you can actually have a structure where everyone on the team is giving input on how Steph should shoot, mm-hmm. or at least the equivalent, the metaphorical equivalent would be everybody's giving input on how he should shoot 3. And that's often not very useful. Mm-hmm. It's actually not useful. It's rarely useful to take in everyone's votes equally. And it's kind of, I think about that quite often. You're being gracious because I really struggle. I've struggled to get to that point where I can just take in all of the feedback and really love it all for what it is and count the votes. Yeah. But not equally and give certain weight to different votes over others. And but it is, I think, the thing that a lot of CEOs struggle with, leaders struggle with of all kinds, is what makes a really great CEO someone that sees universal truths. But what makes someone a really great manager is someone that sees individual truths. Uh-huh. And I think those are usually at odds. And so a CEO, I'm more wired to see the universal truths and see, wow, this is an opportunity for a business to succeed because I see this universal truth and path that could be the case, that could be the truth. Whereas a manager really becomes a great manager because they see the individual truths of their 8 direct reports all have completely individual truths or individual styles. Mm-hmm. Whereas in how it translates into management for me is I would often struggle with trying to manage everyone the same instead of individually. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that it is. I remember hearing one of my favorite people, Bay Area. He's an executive at Facebook, and he was talking about another executive of his early years, and who's now a very famous executive, but saying that's no longer at the company, but saying that person was a great leader but a terrible manager. Uh-huh. And I said, what do you mean by that? Because I had never heard those contrasted. And he said he was amazing at getting everybody motivated to run through walls, and it's what we needed. We actually needed a great leader, but he just didn't care about management. Right. And so I had to really manage myself, and so that anecdote created this space where I think I became okay with being more aligned towards inclined towards universal truths than individual truths, but also aware that to be a great manager, I need to get better at understanding there are individual truths as well.
Well, I think it also says, that you need to know your own strengths and weaknesses, and that you may decide, I really am strong in this realm. I'm not so strong in the other, and I'm going to find other people to do that more. To not try to be a master at every skill in the book, that could be, it could be distracting, that you can't necessarily say, I'm going to do all things for all people at all times.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's a conversation for another day, but something that you helped me with was it's a trap to try to be good at everything. And that's a poor use of energy. You would not have a point guard that is trying to master all positions. They elevate the team by making sure they're really great at what they're great at.
That's right.
And investing in those strengths while being aware of the weaknesses. But okay, so that's a little bit of the background of us. And one of the things that this is just an experiment, these check-in episodes, see how they go, but would be to go over some of the things that the top takeaways that we have from the previous episodes.
Sure.
So would love to open it up with the top takeaways from maybe episode 1 and Justin Kahn, just if you remember them, if they come to mind.
Sure.
The top takeaways for you.
Sure. Well, I thought it was fantastic that you started with Justin as, the leadoff for Below the Line, because he has been so tremendously successful, right? He's already gotten to where you would dream of getting if you were a young founder. I want to one day have $1 billion exit, and he did that. And so when he says doing that is not going to make your life perfect, it's believable, right? So it's one thing if a random person says, being too attached to that outcome isn't going to make
not even perfect. He said, he might not have said this on the podcast, but he said it in our conversations. It might not. It is not going to make you happy. Your happiness will come elsewhere if it comes, or you could be, he knows friends that are unhappy in that same.
Right. He's totally clear
position.
That having done that, he test drove the concept and he found it wanting. And that very much, I think, is like the story of the Buddha, right? The Buddha is a prince and then has had all of the worldly pleasures you could possibly hope to have, right? There's wealth, there's marriage, there's privilege. It's all there for him, and yet still there's suffering. And so when the teaching comes that you may have to do something about your attachments to find happiness, it's believable. It's not just the booby prize. It's not just because you haven't been able to succeed, then you have to settle for this other way. No, even if you've utterly succeeded, there's still work to be done in finding a real ground for happiness and authentic acceptance.
Yeah, I've heard Buddhism described as aristocratic philosophy and I think as you mentioned that it maybe that's why. So I've heard Buddhism is an aristocratic philosophy, Christianity is a pauper's philosophy, and maybe it actually stems from you have a prince and a pauper, and quite literally actually. You have Jesus as a penniless preacher roaming through Israel and Lebanon, and you have a prince and Buddha, and there's so much overlap between the philosophies, but that is very interesting that the genesis of Buddha's life was as a prince.
But of course, if Jesus begins as the penniless pauper, he's also he's the king of heaven in some ways, right?
Right. He is the king of,
he is the son of God,
of all, and decides to become just like Buddha, actually.
Right. So they just start, at opposite ends of the spectrum, but there's a meeting, of these polarities.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like Buddha is like, or maybe it appeals to the aristocrats because you have the wealth and you realize that's not it. And for Jesus, it may resonate with the poor because you don't have it, but that's not it.
Yeah, you don't have to wait. You don't have to first accumulate $1 million before you can actually begin making contact with something deeper and more gratifying.
Right. So with Justin's episode, some of the takeaways that I had are along those lines. One of the things that I loved is, my top takeaways from that one was very tactical, just deleting apps from your phone, getting rid of distractions, deleting apps from your phone. I deleted the email app from my phone, and I have loved it. You don't need to be reachable at all times on your phone. As well as, I think he also put his phone in grayscale, and he went similar to what we were just chatting about. He went from the tactical to the thematic. That was a takeaway, and then the thematic takeaway of it's not in the results, and the results are not where it's at. It's the results are that's not where happiness lies. And his approach to increasing baseline happiness, which he talks about throughout the episode. Which one of the things was, it's not in the results. And this is someone that can say that because they've seen, as you stated, you've seen all of the results that you would draw up as an entrepreneur or as a human, maybe living in 2019 secular world, or just the culture that we live in. And I really, really resonated with both of those points. The results one really stuck with me.
Well, and I think that when he talks about doing the gratitude journal, it's very much in that, in that same direction, because rather than saying, I'll feel grateful when I get to that outcome, instead it's like, no, actually right this very moment, that I'm already supported by so many things, right? We don't notice how much is already present. Like, we're sitting here, and I could be radically grateful for the fact that there's oxygen in this room, but we just take it utterly for granted until there's no oxygen and we're drowning.
Right.
You're like, oh my God.
I heard from so many people. A lot of people wrote in actually just asking, what's the app that Justin uses? You talked about using a gratitude app, and I actually don't know. I don't remember off the top of my head which app it was, because it was a few weeks ago. But I just use a pen and paper each morning, and I'm not someone that has had $1 billion exit, and yet I can absolutely validate that concept of a gratitude journal as one of my favorite morning rituals and piece of advice that I've ever gotten, of jotting 3 to 5 things down each morning that I'm grateful for, and kind of rewiring how you start the day, but also how you're perceiving the world around you.
Well, just as we were getting ready to begin and you were playing some music and we were kind of going inward for a moment, I just noticed I'm really grateful that I've gotten to get to know you, and that now here we are. And we're doing this podcast, and what an incredible opportunity that you're offering me. And, that I'm incredibly grateful to work with people who are so creative and so capable. It's a joy. Well,
you have helped guide me through some really, really dark moments. And so I give you a lot of credit for helping guide me through all of those moments to this point where I'm, pursuing this project. And for listeners, I mentioned this in the intro episode, that the why behind this is pretty simple. It was originally thinking maybe I should be an executive coach as well, to give people encouragement through these dark moments. And then that evolved to maybe I should write a book on the psychological journey, and through research and chatting with leaders, find the optimal psychological approaches that that inner game, borrowing a lot of the concept from the inner game of tennis, which talk about with Eric Ries in episode 3, but one of the seminal books on sports psychology written 40 years ago. And yet there's not great literature on business psychology and how to navigate that, especially in the startup world where it is just so damn dynamic and changing so quickly, so often. And you live in this world where, it is your stability just never really arrives, or at least it's many years out when you start.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things I love that you're doing with this podcast is you're first publicizing, making it available, that the more manic version, the manic story of the bulletproof CEO is a fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And that first making room for the more vulnerable and authentic truth, that it's really difficult, that you're going to be dealing with great uncertainty, great pressure, and that's going to be painful at times. Just making that permissible to know already means that one can move from the demand to be, killing it all moment to saying, no, I'm really working hard. I'm struggling to understand how to do this. And that once there's room for that to be the ordinary story, then there's much more room for people to turn towards what I would call sane dependence. There's often a notion that if you're going to be a leader, you should be so strong that you don't need other people, that would be somehow infantile to rely on other people, and that the really powerful leaders, they're alone on top of the mountain and they're commanding their forces, and that they are so powerful that they've become utterly autonomous. But I think that's a form of insanity, that at every moment we are radically dependent on everything else, right? We're here completely dependent on the support of the ground beneath us. We are here utterly dependent on the oxygen we're breathing. Nobody would say, oh, he's too needy, he needs his oxygen. But we do say, oh, he just wants attention. But we need attention. It's an ordinary need, and making room within the leadership realm for these needs to be expressed and valorized rather than denigrated.
Well, and one of the things that I talk about in an episode with I believe it was Ryan Caldbeck in the last episode is just in that vein, I think there's the phrase, the adage of comparison is the thief of joy. And I think that not only is that phenomenally true, but also that comparison to the fake is the thief of progress. That it's even more dire than that if you're comparing to the fake, because then when you're going through your journey, you are not, it's cut twice of the harshness of the reality, and then feeling like you are the solitary, you are the only person to experience this reality and these other stories. The other narrative arcs just don't map to anything you're seeing. And then you get the real, that's, inception of the podcast was after failing. I just heard all of these stories of these founders that went through, that I admired, that I only knew they're above the line versions, that would reach out to me, that we'd get dinner, or we'd get coffee, and I would hear the real versions, and I would just be like, fuck, where was this
when I
was
needed
going
to hear
through
about it, right?
Right. What are some of the other takeaways from, I can, I could mention my top takeaways. I'll go for Mike Maple's episode. I love that he talked about fishing with his father, a story when he was young, and just staying in one spot at a lake and winning the fishing tournament and learning from his father to just stay in that one spot instead of just going from spot to spot to spot. And that is, I loved that story. And I want to make sure that we touch on that. He's such a great storyteller as well. What are some other takeaways from the first few episodes that come to mind to you?
Well, I think that is a great story, that we can be so, if we get caught in the comparing mind, we can have the notion that we should have already succeeded. And since we haven't yet gotten where we think we need to be, there's a tendency then to become frantic, to rush to spot to spot to spot, as opposed to saying, no, this might really take time, and that's reasonable, that I'm fishing and I haven't yet caught anything, but I understand that this is a promising location. There's good structure in the water. There's some cool water coming in from that stream. I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to have some faith, and I'm going to keep trying to look more deeply below the surface to understand, what might be going on. What are the fish doing down there? I know we're both fishermen, so,
Yeah, that's right.
So
that's right.
We're likely to enjoy that.
Yeah, we did. Maybe that's why we enjoyed that story extra, a little more than usual. The third episode was Eric Ries, and I think one of the things that he took away, or that I took away from that, and you discussed as well, is that equanimity. And again, it's this thing that was said briefly in the episode, but just stayed with me. And then you brought it up completely independent of me bringing it up, but that equanimity, that ability to hold it all.
Yes.
I guess more than just balance, but the ability to be at peace with holding it all.
Yeah. I think when we're in the midst of a very difficult time, something is stressful, something is painful, we're grappling with something, it's very easy to want to contract against it, to say, how can I get away from that? Or how can I defeat that? Or how can I not feel this terrible way anymore? And what I have come to see from doing this work for a really long time is that it is precisely that contraction against the experience that gives it its real teeth of suffering. And that if we can instead, when we're in the midst of the struggle, say, okay, what part of this have I not yet felt? I want to feel every inch of this suffering, and to really relax and welcome it in. It's incredibly counterintuitive. You're like, no, the whole point is to set higher walls, deeper walls, more defenses against it. But that always turns part of your own experience into an assailing enemy, as opposed to saying that your mind and your confidence may be broad enough that everything can be welcomed in. One of my favorite quotes is from Walt Whitman. And he says, "Do I contradict myself? So I contradict myself. I am vast. I contain multitudes." And so rather than trying to say, no, I must consolidate around the good, it's an opening up. He's saying that the internal infinity is so large that everything can be offered a home. And that then things stop persecuting in the same way, that it may still be difficult, but it stops being overwhelming.
It's dialectical. It's both dialectic, kind of meaning both can be true. And I think that that's one of the, in true below the line fashion, what is going through my head right now, below the line version, is I think that's why and I think there's an important viewpoint of mine that I should mention, is that I'm a big believer that we require ideals, these ideals that we think about, that we may never and likely will never get close to. They are the guiding principles in our lives, and they can at least get us from where we are to where we want to be, like the North Star. The purpose is not to get to the North Star, but it can help you navigate. And a great ideal in my life, or ideal of what I strive to be like, is Christ-like. And I mean this in a not kind of the cartoonish Christian sense. And this has never come up in the podcast, and I rarely talk about this, but again, like in the below the line version, and you and I have spoken about this, what I love about the capital M mythology of this Christ figure is that it is an ideal unlike any other in that time and place of 2,000 years ago, when gods were seen as the more super the god, the better, the more indestructible, the better.
Yes.
And that it is that God is through strength and perfection, and yet there's this, and I think this is why this this narrative and this story was just so why it grabbed humanity in the way that it did. Is you have this character that is God that's like, no, I'm actually going to go the exact opposite direction from the end all be all to completely imperfect and vulnerable and in the dialectic, I'm going to go from infinity to finite to death for the salvation in life for those around me. I think that's one of the most, and I think Western society, we have this model in our minds, whether we know it or not, this model of going through, I mean, as you're talking about kind of equanimity, just the story of this penniless preacher of Jesus being like, okay, I am going to die tomorrow, and his followers saying, yeah, we can get you out of the city.
Yes.
We can help you escape. He's like, no,
I'm staying right here.
I'm staying right here. And I also know that one of you is going to be the reason that I'm going to die. And it's like when you pull off that kind of, 2019 anti kind of Christian is for children type of view, and you look a little bit deeper into this theology or this philosophical viewpoint, it is so, talk about vast and contradicting and dialectic and to what you're saying. Talk about the equanimity of an individual.
I mean, I remember very much when you had your daydream about what if Jesus was one of the Avengers? This is one of the things I love about James, is that he thinks he's very much a Christian man, but it is a very playful and authentic version. It's not like, oh, I have to just say whatever is in the Bible. No, I'm allowed to retell and invent another chapter to Jesus. And in this story, Jesus is in the Avengers, and they're all getting ready to go off and fight the really bad villain, and he's like the worst villain. And they're all getting their costumes on, and they're going, Jesus is just kind of hanging out. He's like, hey, don't worry, I've got this. And they're, well, what are you going to do, Jesus? And Jesus said, well, I'm going to die. The fact that you could have a daydream about that, I just thought was so beautiful.
Well, that's a perfect, that's kind of it's a great backdrop to, the modern version of these Greek gods or Roman gods is something like the Avengers or Superman, which the reason I think Superman is not a story that people grasp to in this world of these billion-dollar mega hit global phenomenon superhero movies. The reason Superman is not, well, and he was a big character in the 20th century, but not one that is universally loved, is because he's perfect. He literally, like, they had to create, it's so boring. They had to create kryptonite. I'm not a huge comic book fan, so I'm going to get these things wrong. But, I think they had to he just kept acquiring these skills year after year as they developed the character. And then they're like, all right, he has everything. Laser vision, can cool down anything with his breath, can lift up, a planet, can fly, impenetrable, all of these things. And then they're like, oh no, he has no vulnerabilities, and became boring. Whereas, the Avengers, for the most part, are still quite literally, impenetrable. Or at least they're
very human in some ways.
In some ways, they are human.
They all have their dramas and their vulnerabilities and insecurities.
And I think someone like this Christ figure would take it to this extreme of just being in the Avenger, house and just saying, while they're gearing up, putting on their shields, putting on their suits and everything, he's just chilling in his and his Jesus guard, just saying, I got this, guys. I'm just gonna die. And then being so wildly confused, which I think it must have been such a confusing character to follow 2,000 years ago. And yet, in a deep sense, it obviously grabbed onto our consciousness and unconsciousness and in a deep way in the last 2,000 years. I think similar to something like Buddhism of being the prince, but walking away from it all because you, in a kind of colloquial sense, that ain't it.
For sure. And, it is an idea that rather than accumulating as a path to happiness, that you can accumulate special skills, you can accumulate wealth, you can accumulate power, and use all of that to try to buttress the isolated self. But it is lonely. And that in some ways, the commitment that Christ makes to die in some ways is deeply generous, not only to other people, but that it is only through releasing the small self that one can actually be connected to everything that is. And so it's not a sacrifice. That this radical sacrifice is a way to finally make contact to something much larger, that is inexhaustible.
Yeah, it is. I think that's one of the things that is tough about being one of the strangest, toughest things about being a CEO is that you cannot, and an episode that's coming up shortly, I just recorded, is touches on this. You can't quit, and it's a very weird concept that is, the difference between a palace and a prison is who has the key.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are in prison or a palace, but you cannot leave, it can feel extremely imprisoning. And that's what this guest on the episode said. One of the hardest things about being a founder and CEO was that he knew he could not quit.
Mm-hmm.
He had started on this path and had to see it through, through either good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an interesting, I had not heard that phrase, but it comes to mind in this conversation. So from Equanimity and Eric Ries, episode 4, which was with Catherine McCarran, my top takeaway there was she talked about just needing to be a cage-free chicken. She could not be within a larger organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that phrase stuck with me. And I think it stuck with me because, and that concept stuck with me because in many ways that's a limitation, not being able to get along with other people in maybe a company setting or a safer setting. And I think that for all of us, founder or not, it is discovering that your weaknesses can be your strengths. If you listen to them, your strengths can absolutely be your weaknesses. They're so rarely ever two separate buckets. They are the same thing, just utilized in different ways. And that stuck with me of kind of knowing who you are, and in listening to that. And that does not mean it is hard feeling like you need to go create things. You can't just fall in line and get on someone else's ship. But she listened to that.
Right. I think that's also very true about you. You started a couple companies. You started Tilt. You then were acquired by Airbnb. You did that ride for a while, but it really isn't where you're most at home, because I think you do best when you get to have really big ideas and take steps to put them to make them be realized, and to have to work within so many layers of hierarchy didn't suit you well at the end of the day,
Yeah, I remember hearing with an Enneagram personality test. There's like 9 numbers, and you find out what number you are, and almost a sign that you are that number is that when you hear it, you just see the downsides of being that type. And I think one of the hardest parts about being yourself and becoming yourself is that you're so aware of the downsides of your makeup. And we spend so much of our time idealizing who we're not, when if you can, and it's a daily journey and commitment, but when you can say, okay, this is me, and there is strength in this. And it's one of the things that Eric Ries also talks about. He's like, when you're getting started in building a company, if you only have 12 customers, how can you turn that into a superpower? How can you just spend an entire afternoon of just thinking, how could this be a superpower that we only have 12 customers? Well, maybe we can charge them all $10,000 instead of $50. Or how can I can actually interact with all 12 of them, but in a individual sense. How can we listen to who we are and say, how is that a superpower? For me, it was just through trying other realms, and I think for Catherine as well, trying to fit in into someone else's ship before realizing, oh, fuck, I have to just go start my own thing again. That is a superpower to where that is where you can be most useful if you listen to that.
No, one of the things that I think is really important in psychoanalysis is that it is a way of working with people that doesn't seek to veneer skills over the core of who the person is, because all veneers are shallow and tend to get scratched, and then the whatever's underneath breaks through. Psychoanalysis aims to bring about what I would call radiant change. And by that, I don't mean that you're going to be all light and shiny, but from the inside out. And I don't think it is much use to merely veneer a lot of leadership skills over who you are. It's going to be brittle, and under moments of stress, it's going to break down and other things are going to break through. I think much more valuable to really become familiar with who you are in your strength and your vulnerabilities, and to use that as the foundation for the kind of leader you're going to be. It's not much use to try to be somebody else and be that version of a leader, as opposed to say, okay, who am I? And given my disposition, how can I develop these capacities in a way that is true and that therefore will be durable, will be radiant?
Or what are some of the other takeaways from the recent episode? And by the way, some of the feedback, speaking of feedback, have gotten us to speak louder into the mic, or bring the mic closer to me. So for me and guests. So hopefully this is close enough. All right. Yeah. What are some of the other takeaways that come to mind from the recent episodes?
Well, I've just spent the last day listening to your episode with Ryan Callback, and I just love that he's willing to come out there in such a vulnerable way and say, this is hard. I struggle. And I think that beginning to have that be part of the ordinary conversation of the Valley really makes possible an evolution in what we think of as a leader. That rather than thinking of a leader as somebody who is so confident, so in charge, that they never have a moment of anxiety, vulnerability, he really dispels that. And he says, no, I'm a leader. I've been successful, and I had radical moments of vulnerability,
Yeah, his specificity was really refreshing. Like, he would give actual stories of a founder. Talking about, he's at Union Square Ventures, one of the best investors in the world, and they're funded by them, and he's at a board meeting there, and had to take time to go lay down in the bathroom in the stall, and I think he said he put his literal head on the ground to lay down because he was so overwhelmed with stress, and that it is. If you listen to a handful of these episodes, you can feel like, oh, well, it's hard for everyone. And it's, we know that. Well, one, to your point, no CEO while they're in it says, holy shit, this is really hard and I'm really struggling. Very few do. Right. He has in the last year, right. And that's been just so it's why his tweet threads on exactly what he's going through have been shared so much. But yeah, that specificity of, it was so...
Well, it's
so refreshing.
It's so striking that he goes into the bathroom to lie down, because it's not yet in a place where he could come in and say, this is very stressful, I'm going to lie down for a moment, and then come into the meeting, and there would be a good space set aside for that. It has to be done in secret in sort of the shameful place of the bathroom. And, what I would hope for is that we can increasingly have a culture where contact with authentic vulnerability is not seen as a weakness. It is actually seen as a strength, because one is therefore capable of honest reflection. There's an analyst, David Rosenfeld, who has a notion called sane. I've talked about it a moment earlier, called sane dependency. Mm-hmm. And he says that in the narcissistic organization, it is as though there is an internal gang, like the mafia. And the mafia says, if you're in the mafia, we're going to protect you. We're going to get you all the perks. Just stay with us and it'll be good. But if you try to leave us, we're going to kill you. Mm-hmm. And that the internal gang says to us in some ways.
That is so funny to think about it that way, but that is, yeah.
If you ever go away from us, this sort of internal notion of perfection and invulnerability, we're going to annihilate you. That it rules out the possibility of usefully depending on other people. So he says in that podcast, like, I'm a big believer in therapy, but in the midst of it, I didn't have a coach. I didn't do therapy. And I felt like I just had to keep going and going and going. And they're saying, take a week off, and he wouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And I think in retrospect, he realizes that he had cut himself off from necessary help, and that seeing help not as something you do because you've broken down, you're too weak, you're too ordinary, but that actually the capacity to look for help and to get help is an essential part of a good leader. Mm-hmm. Nobody would say, oh, coming back to Steph Curry, what a weak basketball player. He has a coach, Steve right. Kerr. You know what I mean? Like, no, of course.
Oh, he needs a shooting coach? Yeah. He must not be very good. Right?
Yeah. So, why does Durant come to the Warriors? They come because there's a really good coach there who mm-hmm. actually allows the players to have correct autonomy and helps them work together in a way that elevates everybody on the team. Hmm.
Yeah, Ryan it's more brave than people think, because mm-hmm. if you're just reading on Twitter, you're like, well, my friend talks about how hard it is right now in their life on Facebook on X, Y, and Z, and that vulnerability is just as valuable. But for folks to get a sense for why he was so scared to tweet that out is because Silicon Valley is a game of momentum. Mm-hmm. And in it is posturing to the absolute max. Because we live in such impartial information, you just want to hear who is breaking out and is becoming invincible.
Right.
And we have these fake versions of stories of companies that seemed invincible.
Right.
And so the game is find more invincible stories.
Right.
When, that's a fake version of Facebook being invincible.
Right.
They maybe IPO at 100 billion, but there was a point in time when they almost had to take a 80% haircut in their valuation because things were not going well. Mm-hmm. But you don't hear that point of the story.
Right.
You don't hear the point of layoffs across different behemoths. Mm-hmm. There's a story of Google that I never heard, but then I also didn't believe until I actually the article was sent to me, and when it happened, I believe it was like in 99, 2 years in, they had 400 people. And there was a moment where Larry Page, who was the CEO at the time, just came into an all hands and said, all product managers are done. Mm-hmm. Like you're let go. Mm-hmm. We're not doing well, and we're getting rid of this whole entire department. Mm-hmm. And then with pure chaos ensued because of just the delivery, the execution of that strategy. And then he was replaced as CEO, but they made it seem like they're bringing in, a veteran.
Right.
But that was very much, you are being replaced, mm-hmm. let go mm-hmm. for posterity. We're going to keep you at the company though. And you just don't hear, you think, oh, it's Google, it's bulletproof. Or it's Facebook. And then you have these investors that look for whatever else is invincible next. And it's in a lot of ways, Ryan maybe going through his mind was like, I might be giving this all away by showing that we are not invincible.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the reasons I love to read biographies, because you get to study how people actually did it, right? I'm reading Ulysses S. Grant's biography right now, and it's ludicrous. It's 700 pages long, but it's just amazing to see the moments where he was an utter failure. He had deep problems with alcohol. He was not well suited for civilian life, but there was something about the Civil War and his capacity to stay calm under incredible duress that made him a brilliant general. And watching him, go through these moments of despair and endurance and coming back, and his ability to think, and, it was not a linear path. Even once he became the head of the Union forces, there were setbacks. And one of the things that I love is that these battles, these were just terrible, terrible battles in the Civil War. Thousands, tens of thousands of people dying that you've sent into battle. And they would go on sometimes for 2-3 days. And after the first day, your army would be in shock and devastation. And Grant realized, the previous generals, after a rough first day, they would retreat. They would go, it's too hard, it's too much, we're going to go back, we need more men, we have to. And Lincoln gets so upset because none of them ever pressed the thing. Grant realized that if he counterattacked on the second day, that he would utterly own the other forces' psychology. Like, oh my God, if they're coming at us right now, they must be way ahead of us, So
Right.
he understood the psychology of momentum in a very profound way. And, to get to understand from this remove the lessons he learned is a real pleasure.
Well, and I think it's, there's value in Ryan being that candid in a world where people are not that candid, because it is in a similar form and fashion. It is people like, wow, he must be so strong to be able to share. And it really is a sign of strength to share that the fact that you're so far from invincible. You're going through this really big thing right now, or you recently got through something really, really big in a world that's full of posturing. I think the thing that he talked about that I also really appreciated and had not heard anyone talk about, which is, it kind of actually blew my mind as I thought about it afterwards, that he talked about the incredible amount of jealousy that the startup realm engenders within us. And it's so funny. Talk about like the gratitude of oxygen. It's everywhere, and yet we don't appreciate it and give it its due. Jealousy and envy, it could be the most destructive of all cardinal sins. And it exists in such immense ways in this and I think in everyone's lives, and we don't acknowledge it, we don't talk about it, and it seems so weak to say, "Oh, I'm jealous." But I thought that was really really thought provoking. Him just hitting it head on, of just the jealousy that he'll feel at times, and not just at times, often.
Yes, yeah, like all the time. You say. I would distinguish though between jealousy and envy. In jealousy, we in some ways want a situation that somebody else is in, right? So you might be jealous. Oh, he's in a relationship. He's got that girl who's so fantastic. I'm jealous of him. In envy, it's a much more destructive state. It's like that person is somebody that I wish I could be, and therefore I want to destroy them. I want to run them down. So when kids get into calling other kids names, that's an effort to export the badness into somebody else. And rather than being able to learn and to say, wow, that person's doing something amazing, let me actually try to bring some of that person inside of myself to identify. I try to identify some with Grant or Lincoln so that I can learn something from it. And envy, rather than identify, there's a destructive act, a sense of destroying the very thing that is of value. It's the opposite of what you were talking about, was having ideals.
Interesting. Bless you. That was a good distinction, thought-provoking distinction. And I want to touch on the other episodes before we part, and that is Corby Davidson, his episode. One of my favorite takeaways from that, in addition to just being so entertained by that individual, he is this kind of just the thing that spoke to me was at 23 he said, "Oh, Howard Stern, I want to be like that." And maybe that wasn't. It certainly wasn't envy. Definitely.
No, I think it was much more an identification and like, oh, right. That's beautiful. How do I do it?
How do I do it?
What is the owner's manual for that?
Right. How can I borrow from this ideal? And he, and then he's, for many intents and purposes, he has become that in sports radio. He is this larger than life figure in Texas sports radio, and he's just so entertaining. One of the things that I also took away was his peace everywhere he was. He just was happy with wherever it was. And I think that tying to his entertainment, like he's able to think so freely about his craft when he's happy where he was. And each step along the path of this ideal of Howard Stern, he thought, well, if this is it, then that's great too. And then he just kept moving up. And now he's, the top spot of millions of people listening to him, and including myself growing up basically every day. And it was interesting to hear him say that an important aspect was just being really happy everywhere, every route. And there's, it's, we can laud ambition, but it was almost kind of a perspective of ambition as vice, and it can get in the way of being really great at your job.
Well, I mean, I think he even described that what he wanted to be able to do was go with the flow in an interview, to try to put the person he's interviewing so at home that they might say something that they never expected they would say. And that the idea of these things need to be accomplished in this interview can be a recipe for only doing what you already know. So there's a great psychoanalyst named Bion, and Bion has a concept in psychoanalysis that the analyst should be without memory or desire. Because when you come in and you're working with a patient, in some ways each day you should play with the idea that you've never met this patient before. You may have been in a 5-year treatment with them, but that if you're treating the patient that you remember, you're actually blind to what is potentially becoming alive in this exact moment. And so I think his emphasis on being content with where he is allows a kind of spontaneity of surprise. Like, oh, I had no idea we were going to talk about this. And if I had only followed my pre-prepared agenda questions, we never would have gotten to it.
That is one of the central tensions of my life, is going into a scenario and wanting this end goal, thinking that is true and right, and working towards that, rather than kind of, I don't know if it's judo. I think it's judo, to go with the movement.
Yes.
And your
Aikido, yeah.
Yes, your opponent's weight, use it against them, and or in just a human relationship where it's not adversarial, but it is this higher goal can be achieved by being open to where it can go, instead of, and I'm in a specific story, I could say, I would get a coffee with someone that I'm trying to recruit to Tilt or to Airbnb, and that is the end all be all goal, rather than maybe I could actually learn so much from this person and realize this person might not be the right fit, but moving 15 degrees to the left could be a phenomenally insightful conversation for what actually what I truly want. And it's, or what we both want. I deal with that constantly. I know it. And I know that early on in my career, it was just so over-indexed towards, all right, I know the outcome that I want out of this interaction. Now, let me move towards that.
Right. Yeah. In that universe, everything is already stale.
Right.
As opposed to really continually having goals, having aspirations, but keeping open a space for the unexpected, for the new creation, for the collaborative, and what it might reveal.
Right. One of the last episodes that had some takeaways for me was Hannah Wilson's and Max Roser. Hannah's she's a leader within an organization, an executive and a high flying executive here in the Bay Area, sales leader. And her just talking about, it was really my wife saying that one of the things that she really resonated with in all of the episodes was Hannah saying that you can't have it all. And it's, I think she was specifically talking about between family, career, and social life. She just had to put social on the back burner, and that was a sacrifice. She said it so, matter of factly, and I think it's because she really was intentional about and deliberate about, okay, this is going to take a sacrifice. And I think the resonance for myself and for my wife was that it's just refreshing to hear someone say that it requires immense sacrifice, and you can have maybe two of these three, but not all three. And in a world where I think you get these, I think the smart people do tell you that, but you get these signals all around you that you should have it all, and this person or that person does have it all.
Yeah. Yeah, that there would be some workaround, something so clever that nobody ever thought of before, that you wouldn't have to ever endure a loss.
Right. Or you're not doing it right if you don't have it all.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
With Max, the thing that came to mind with, or that has stuck with me from his episode is just his entire organization, Our World in Data, is essentially pitting perception versus reality, of your perception of the way the world is going versus the data and where it actually shows. And we live in a world where for example, we think that it's, we're becoming less and less equal globally, and it's actually we're becoming more equal globally.
Yeah.
And it is a real, and just you ask the average person on the street, and they would not know that. They would think that, well, I'm being fed this narrative that's completely opposite of that. And it is on a national level. There are countries where it is diverging, but globally, where actually it's, the trends are pretty damn strong. Of never been more prosperous, never been more educated, never been more I think it's never been more equal. Some really powerful things. And I think one of the things I took away from that episode was, and we have a long way to go on all of these fronts, but certainly the perception was different than the reality. And as a creator, one of the things that I continually struggle with is the perception versus reality. You can have a growth graph that's going in the right direction, and you think, but you're like that, but that's not the whole story. And I know that the reality is we're making a lot of the wrong decisions, or the opposite, where your perception is that it is going in the wrong direction because we only have 12 customers. But the reality is so widely different than that. And it just has stuck with me, that theme over and over again of perception versus reality. So it can be so wildly different, often is.
Here in the Bay Area, very liberal part of the world, and I'm definitely in that camp. But I sometimes like to provocatively say, when people, when world politics comes up, that America is the most just superpower ever. And I'll say that, and then I'll get a lot of outrage coming back. Well, what about Iraq? What about particularly now with our current administration, it's easy to point out all of the failings in America's leadership. And I agree, they're vast and deep failings. But if you compare it to all the other superpowers that have ever been, England, Rome, the Mongol emperor, the amount of justice and restraint has increased vastly, even if there is still so much further to go in it really having a true world justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is and both can be true.
Yes,
it's a long way to go, but the reality is not. The perception of it is of whatever the case may be, your perception in the day. I think about, so I had this heart condition, and I remember going to the doctor, and he's just so dry. I loved this guy. He's so dry, just so matter of fact. And I said, I feel one of the appointments, I told him maybe a year or two into this irregular heartbeat, and I said, it just feels off. And they did the test, and he goes, everything is fine. And I said, but it just feels off. And he goes, yes, you might feel that way, but everything is fine. Mm. And it was this small little interaction that has stayed with me, because we can feel everything is crazy. Mm-hmm. And there's something to listening to, your intuition or internal voice. But it was as if he's seen this every day in his job of people feeling something, but the perception was not the reality. And he had answered this question a million times of, yes, you feel that way, but everything's fine. Yeah.
But I think in that dry voice, he's also, one of the things I'm sure that happens when you've had an irregular heartbeat is you become hypersensitive to your heart.
Right, which I totally did.
And so that hypersensitivity can lead to anxiety, which can lead to a kind of negative feedback loop. And he's trying to say right now, don't believe that negative feedback loop. I'm telling you, nothing's wrong.
Right.
And so the next time you're tempted to go off down that path, you're like, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to feed any more energy into the anxiety of it.
Yeah, it was so, it was helpfully dismissive in the way that he was like, oh, you feel that way? Okay, well, everything's fine. And everything was fine. And, it was months later, I thought about how everything was fine.
So maybe 15 years ago, I was skiing, and I was in an extreme skiing clinic because I wanted to learn how to jump off Corbett's Couloir in Jackson Hole. And I was skiing better than I'd ever skied, and they were going to teach us how to jump off a rock. And so the first time down, go down, jump off the side of the rock, nailed it. I was like, great. They said, this time go bigger. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go bigger. And I go down, and I decide I can go off the front of the rock. And right before I go off the rock, I realize, oh no, I haven't gone up one level of difficulty. I've gone up like 5. Like instead of a 5-foot drop, it's a 20-foot drop. And I have no idea how to do this. And it's too late to turn, like if I tried to turn, it just would have been a catastrophe. And so I go off the front of the rock. I don't remember being in the air. Then I land, okay, but I haven't done the turn in the middle of the air that you should have done. And I get caught up in the heavy snow. I fight against falling. I fall back across my body, and I snap my ACL. And a year later, my knee's not right, and I'm going to see this osteopath who's essentially quadriplegic from his own car crashes. And he asked me, Peter, how'd you do it? And I start telling him the story, and I start telling him all of my psychology about athletics and competitiveness. And he says to me, no one cares. Now, if somebody else had said that to me, no one cares why I tore my ACL, I might have taken exception. But clearly, whatever was wrong with my knee was like nothing compared to what this guy had lived through. And I realized when he said that I had jumped off that rock in my imagination 1,000 times. And I had stopped learning anything from jumping off that rock in my imagination after the first 50 jumps. And now I was just repeating it. And he was telling me that circular thinking is not serving you. And it was really profound in actually getting over the anxious trauma in my knee and saying like, yes, I did that. I'm not going to replay it. And so the thought will come up. Still to this day, there are moments it comes up and there can be a wave of regret. And I'm like, no, let it go. I've had that thought. There's nothing new here.
Well, and bringing it back to Steph Curry, one of the things they teach you in shooting is to have a short-term memory.
Yeah.
Forget the actual miss, and you have to forget the miss. And if you can obviously learn, and you learn through missing, but if that is the message that plays on repeat over and over again of missing, it can be absolutely debilitating from making it.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for the time today, and I hope to do these recaps pretty often with you because it's I know that you're listening to the episodes and having all of these rich thoughts from an executive coach perspective, and can't wait for the next one. One of the things I want to touch on before you leave, though, which is very relevant to today in May, and that is May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I think it's no secret that this project is a healthy dose of mental health to it. And one of the things that I want to touch on in this for just the month of May is it's two things, and I think it's two parts. One is mental health and one is mental illness, and they're very different things, though they live in the same family. One is mental health is more like lifting 300 pounds. Mental illness is more like diabetes, and both are critically important that we understand and pay attention to. On the mental health side of things, just a PSA of just the best piece of advice that I've ever gotten on being able to find a groove in mental health and lifting those 300 pounds would be the first thing. In many of these things we've chatted a lot about. I think about it in terms of 5 parts. One is sleep, diet, exercise, stress management, and then exogenous compounds. And so the first one is sleep. Best advice I ever got. And feel free to write these down on a notepad in terms of lifting your 300 pounds. Maybe they'll be helpful for you. Sleep is waking up at the same time every morning. So helpful for my just rhythm in life and the circadian rhythms of 24 hours and not just while you're asleep, just setting your rhythm. That was a sleep doctor gave me that advice, and I tell so many people about that. But waking up, finding a time and waking up at the exact same time or as close to it as you can each morning. Within about 8 days, you'll be set in that rhythm and you'll be glad that you started to do that. On diet, one of the things that I chat about with Justin Kahn is I don't really drink alcohol, and it's just a personal choice that's started to serve me. And since our conversation, since our episode a few weeks ago, he has now given up alcohol as well. And I think within the entire realm of diet, for me, just giving up alcohol improved my sleep greatly, as well as decreased anxiety in many untold ways that I just didn't know. On a Monday afternoon or a Tuesday, I was struggling from the anxiety induced from drinking Friday night or Saturday night when I thought I was kind of off the clock. I actually biologically was carrying that with me. Third, on best piece of advice I got on exercise, just 15 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 times a week, just getting the heart rate up, getting the toxins out of your body, and keeping it really small, not feeling like you need to go out and do an hour of exercise every day, but 15 minutes. We have a Peloton bike, which makes it really, they aren't cheap, but it makes it really easy each day to find that time. And I also have great yoga classes and core strength training classes on the iPad version or the app version on your phone that my wife introduced me to, that I also love in terms of convenience, but getting that exercise in. Fourth is stress management, and Hannah Wilson talked about 2 years ago learning about meditation, and it was kind of mandated or is heavily encouraged by her boss at the time, to take these meditation classes, just 5 minutes a day, she said, really is a grounding wire for her. And for me, there's two things within stress management: the power of saying no a lot. So you don't just succumb to the overwhelming nature of saying yes too much. Say no a lot, and almost the art of saying no a lot was really powerful for me, as well as meditating each morning, even 10 minutes. There are a number of apps that you can download to make it easy. Meditation is really helpful to me, but maybe even more so, it's just not taking on too much. And then fourth, exogenous compounds. Within mental health or within mental illness, you can have antidepressants and pharmaceutical approaches, as well as you can be taking vitamins for your physical health and mental well-being. But I think those come in fifth. They are last in the line to the first four. And just wanted to touch on that for listeners. The other camp of mental health is mental illness. And one of the things that we chatted about before we turned on the microphones was just people with clinical anxiety. Only 36% seek treatment and seek help. And we chatted during the episode about the capacity to need. And as creators, or as just people, we see needing as a weakness. And I want to encourage listeners during this month of mental health awareness, especially founders or executives that are extremely competent and have muted their capacity to need, to tap back into that. Because if the vast majority of people with clinical anxiety aren't seeking professional help, that means the vast majority of us going through anxious moments or anxiety that can creep up on us during the course of a day or a week or a month, we probably aren't voicing our need to others as well. And same goes for clinical depression, anxiety's cousin. And so I think the best advice I ever got on that aspect was to tell 3 people. You don't need to dial up a therapist. You don't need to feel like it's this big onerous thing that you need to carve out a week or an hour every week. It can just start with tell 3 people over the next few weeks. Find 3 people that you can tell what you're going through, and it starts just by the verbal articulation. Can give it space it needs. That you shine a light on it. It might be much smaller of a problem than you think. Did you have anything to add on that the topic of mental health or mental illness?
Well, I like how you sort of say that they're both to be worked on, that one has to both take care of places where there may be difficulties or deficits, but that at the same time, one needs to constantly understand and expand on what are the skills, what are the capacities that make for a vibrant human being. And that's not merely the absence of illness. It is an artistic, an aesthetic creation to be truly a vibrant and healthy person. And we're inventing that all the time.
Well, and it's just been my experience in having mental health or mental illness around me since a young age. It is, and thinking more about the proactive mental health approaches in recent years, that it is, you don't want diabetes and you want to be able to lift 300 pounds.
Yes.
And you can be really useful to those around you if both of those are true. So I think it's helpful to take care in both of those camps. Well, Peter, thank you so much for the time today. I can't wait for the next.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. I love that you're doing this, James.
Well, it's because of great people around me that have encouraged this project. So thank you, Peter.
Great.
Hey, friends and listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to hear more of these types of conversations, go over to your favorite podcast app and hit subscribe, or leave us a review. Good or bad, we love hearing from people that appreciate this type of conversation and want more of it. You can also follow us on Twitter at @GoBelowTheLine, as well as see in our Twitter bio our email address for you to shoot us a note on any suggestions of guests or topics that we should cover. We read every single one, so Thank you for those that have already sent those in. That's it for us today. We will see you next time on Below the Line.
Below the Line is brought to you by Straight Up Podcasts.